Thank you so much for being here. So as you can see, I'm really not an expert at Zoom presentations. I'm a bit more used to doing them in person. So please bear with me. Today's presentation is about gender, sexual, and relationship diversity in bereavement and grief, also known as queer experiences of grief. I am also not an expert on queerness or grief. So I'd really like you all to think of this presentation as just food for thoughts. I'm a therapist. I work in private practice in Glasgow. I've been working in private practice since 2018. I identify as queer myself, and I have ended up working with a lot of queer people, people who are gender diverse, people who identify as queer in lots of different ways. And I guess through my work, I've learned a lot about what happens for queer people around bereavement and grief. That's not to say that there is a top secret. Sorry, I need something on camera because I just can't talk to the screen with no faces on. Dave, I'm looking at you. So this isn't a lecture on how queer people grieve. Grief is always completely unique, and it's also completely universal. Everyone feels their grief in their own specific way. I'm not trying to suggest here that queer people grieve differently to straight people, or that there's something special and weird about how queer people grieve. This is just what I'm going to try and show today is how normal experiences of grief can be sort of interrupted or can interact with gender, sexual, and relationship diversity. And this is just food for thought so that when you're working in death and dying with people who are, queer or gender diverse, you can just have this at the back of your mind. Hopefully, it will make you just a little bit more aware, and it will help tap into your natural capacity for empathy and kindness and tap into your humanity. So just a few notes on terminology. Do we want to admit Tina Turner into the group? Should I admit? I'll admit. So terminology, gender, sexual, and relationship diversity is kind of like the official term to refer to all the ways in which people can experience and express gender, sexual identities, and relationships. LGBTQIA plus. So L is for lesbian, gay is for G is for gay, B is for bisexual, T is for trans, Q is for queer, I is for intersex, and A is for aromantics and asexuals. And then the plus is for all the other ways in which people can be queer. Queer is a term that can be, it's quite used nowadays. It's a word that I use for myself. It can be a bit divisive. Not that long ago, it was a slur. And so some people who have experienced that word being thrown at them as a slur don't enjoy using it nowadays. I'm aware of that. It's a term that I use a lot. If it is a trigger for you, if it is a problem for you, feel free to speak up in the chat, and I will do my best to try and use different terms. I just wanted to acknowledge, just in case people don't know, so non-binary, genderqueer, and gender non-conforming are terms that we use for people who are gender diverse. So people who experience and express gender in ways that are not just like men are men and women are women. Pansexual is a term for people who are attracted to anybody, so women, men, trans people, and gender diverse people. Polyamory is a form of non-monogamy. It's when people can be in love with more than one person and are in relationships with more than one person. Ethical or consensual non-monogamy is similar, except people don't necessarily fall in love, but they might have multiple partners, multiple relationships. And then relationship anarchy is when people choose to view all of their relationships on an equal footing, whether it's family, romantic partners, friends, sexual partners, without prioritizing. Whereas in society, often in straight relationships, family is more important than friendship, but relationship anarchy we put every relationship on an equal footing. So these are all terms, in case you're not familiar with them, that might come up, that they're all versions of queerness. Okay, so we're going to talk about marginalization. I've got a survey from 2014, which I know is a very long time ago. It's 10 years ago now, but there's just not a ton of data. So I found this survey by Stonewall and the Cooperative Funeral Care of over 500 LGBT adults, and it found that 1 in 4 expected to face barriers when planning a funeral. 1 in 4 worried about being treated poorly by a funeral director. 2 in 5 feared discrimination from religious leaders, and 1 in 5 feared discrimination from family. Obviously, the good news about this is that 3 in 4 did not expect to face barriers, you know, or like 4 in 5 did not expect discrimination from family. So that's wonderful. But it's worth acknowledging that there is a minority of queer people, but a big minority who expect discrimination and barriers. And I think, as everyone here probably knows, when we're going through bereavement, when we're grieving, when we're planning a funeral, it's a time when all we need is kindness, humanity, and acceptance, rather than feeling marginalized or fearing rejection or experiencing rejection. So the way I've structured most of today's slides is they're all little vignettes spoken from the I. So they're all taken from different people. Some of them are my therapy clients, some of them are my friends, some of them are me. And it's all experiences around grief that queer people can have. And I just encourage you to think of them as little stories that a queer person is sharing with you right now. So, sorry, here we go. Oh. My partner died suddenly and unexpectedly 2 years ago. My parents and brother did come to the funeral, of course, and they were supportive enough at the time. But since then, no word. They never mentioned his name. They don't ask me how I'm grieving. They went on holiday to the same place we'd all been, and no one even acknowledged it. The only family member who's asked me about him since he died is my 4-year-old niece. And I can't help but wonder, would they all ignore my grief like that if we had been married or if I had been with a woman? So this is a case of a person who is grieving the death of their partner and is feeling the lack of support from their family. And they don't know and they can't know whether that's because they're gay or if it just would happen anyway. So this is an example of how sexual diversity comes into the grief process and is kind of it's preventing this person from being able to reach out to their family and ask their family for support. I wanted to talk a little bit about religion. So at my grandfather's funeral, as soon as we went into the church and the priest started talking, I felt my grandmother and my mom relax and lean into it. For me, I shut down completely. I know this space is not for me and those rituals are not for me. I know I don't belong in this particular tradition. I just sat through it for my mom's sake. I didn't feel like this was the place where I could say goodbye. I think we all know that in times of bereavement and grief, religion and spirituality and faith can be places of great comfort, where people can relax and feel supported by religious traditions and by their faith. However, for a lot of queer people, a lot of gender diverse people, religion is not necessarily a safe space. And therefore, a lot of rituals and traditions that we have around death and funerals are not necessarily accessible to people in the queer community. And they can actually be a barrier to grief instead of being, you know, a channel that facilitates grief. My wife was very clear that she wanted a non-religious funeral. She died of a long illness, so we had time to discuss these kinds of things. I made that clear to the funeral director. They said no problem. It all seemed very straightforward. We walked into the crematorium for the ceremony, and there was a giant Christian cross dominating the entire room. I didn't get a chance to say anything. There wasn't really an appropriate time. I had a lot going on, but I did think she would have hated that. So again, I would just like people to imagine if you walked into a crematorium and there was a giant pride flag, and maybe you're not queer or the person whose funeral it is not queer, how would you feel if there was this big symbol in the room that was not the symbol that speaks to you or that feels like it invites you in and where you belong. We don't necessarily notice how religion is everywhere in bereavement and grief and death work. So I think it's just worth bearing in mind. Belonging is something that all humans need, and it's something that sometimes queer people don't have automatically. I left my wee Highland village in my late teens, and I'm living my best queer life in Glasgow now. Everyone in my family knows I'm gay, and it's all fine, but I can definitely express myself here in ways that I couldn't back home. Going home for my grandmother's funeral was a bit tough. It was emotional because, of course, I'm sad she's gone and I'll miss her. But there was this added layer of almost trying to not be myself too much. It made me irritable and overly sensitive. And I wish I could have opted out of that and just thought about my gran. Again, I hope this makes sense. I hope you understand how I'm trying to show that as a queer person, a completely normal experience of grief can just get interrupted by effectively just like queer phobia and heteronormativity. Shame is a big, horrible human emotion that we all feel, and that is pretty big in the LGBTQIA plus community. An old friend of mine died of an overdose. I hadn't seen him in a couple of years, but I went back for the funeral. He was the most flaming gay guy you've ever seen, but his whole family just pretended like he wasn't. So I was there with a few other friends from that time, and we're just standing there being queer. And the whole family had no idea what to do with us. It was awkward and sad and horrible. Not being able to grieve a person for who they are or who you know them as, not being able to be yourself at a funeral, is something that makes grief very difficult and the bereavement process extra hard. My mum died of cancer. Once she was diagnosed, we knew she didn't have very long to go, and it turned out to be just a few months. I came out to her ages ago. She wasn't very supportive at the time. By the time she died, she knew my wife, of course. She was there at our wedding, and things were okay. But I never quite could shake the feeling that she wasn't thrilled about her daughter being a lesbian. As soon as she got diagnosed, I felt like we were on the clock, that we had to have that conversation, and it was now or never. And then she just died a few months later, and I guess it'll be never. It's definitely not as if my grief is unique or as if it's all about being queer. My sister's straight, and she's grieving our mom just as much as I am. But also, this conversation we never had, it's just on my mind forever. I know every family has its big family secrets, and I know family secrets come out when people die. I know that's not unique to being queer or being gay, but I think gay people and queer people and trans people live with a lot of secrecy, and it's worth acknowledging how that comes out also with bereavement and grief. Wanting to feel seen. So my partner died. They were NB, non-binary. At a family event a few months later, my cousin kindly wanted to say a few words to acknowledge my bereavement. She misgendered them and got their name wrong. And I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with that. This is a true story that actually happened. A person trying to be really kind and supportive and just getting the queer identity completely wrong. And so again, this person is like trying to receive the love, but it just didn't really land. A few years ago, my child came out to me as non-binary. I had no problem with that. They were in their early 20s. They're exploring their identity. I thought there's lots of talk these days about gender. Honestly, I didn't mind. They changed their name, and that did feel a bit hurtful for me. But again, I thought it's not a big a deal. Mostly, I just didn't want to fight. I mean, what would be the point? They died in a road accident last year. There was this whole thing about the name we'd put on the gravestone. I really wanted their birth name to be on there because I didn't want that to be erased. But of course, we, their dad and their siblings, also wanted to respect who they were becoming. Because they died so suddenly, we never had a chance to find out what they would have wanted. This is an example of how we all need to communicate to our loved ones what we want after we die, but I think maybe queer people even more so than anyone else. I came out as gay in my 40s a few years ago. It's been a long journey for me, not like how kids these days who seem to know exactly who they are and are afraid to tell the whole world. My dad died before I came out. I don't think he would have approved. I know what he was like. I'm under no illusion. But at least he would have died knowing all of me. That's a special kind of pain for people who come out later in life and who've lost someone and they know that they'll never have a chance to be fully known by the person who's gone. So I wanted to talk about shadow loss. Shadow loss is when, just gonna put the camera on again. Shadow loss is when people can experience feelings of grief, even though no one died. There's no bereavement, but nonetheless, there's a feeling of loss that can create a sense of grief. So again, this is a mini case study. I've realized I just couldn't keep being in touch with my parents. It just destroyed me every time we spoke. This is a trans person. I don't know how or why that happens exactly, but every single time it floors me and it feels like I can't move for days on end after we speak. I can't keep living like this. So I've told them I need some space and I told them not to worry. Then my grandparents started calling me insistently, telling me to call my dad. I tried to explain where I was coming from, but they really wouldn't listen. My grandpa got pretty mean. So I just hung up the phone. And I think for now, I won't be calling them back for a while. I've pretty much orphaned myself. So you can see how the grieving process here is very difficult because, first of all, no one died. And second of all, the person who is feeling the loss is also the person who had to create that separation. So it's very difficult to process this kind of shadow loss. I mean, this is very much why we have therapy, basically. Okay, I'm going to talk about suicide. I know this can be a really difficult topic. I mean, all of this is about death. So I know this is tricky and I hope you're taking good care of yourself and, giving yourself time to digest all this information. Suicide can be particularly difficult to talk about, but I really couldn't avoid that topic when talking about gender, sexual, and relationship diversity. So again, the data I have is not very recent, but according to a 2020 study in Britain, 82% of trans people have considered killing themselves and 40% have attempted suicide. That's extremely high compared to the normal population. Sorry, I mean, compared to cis people. The same study shows that in a sample of 400 young people, 56% have attempted suicide and 86% reported suicidality. So again, 86% of young people experiencing suicidal ideation is just extremely high. In 2021, Just Like Us did a survey of about 3,000 young people, so 11 to 18 years old. 1,000 of these young people, identified as LGBTQ+, and they found that 68% of the LGBTQ+ kids had experienced suicidal thoughts compared to 29% of the straight and cis kids. So again, just notice the difference from 68% to 29%. And within the LGBTQ+ young people, lesbians and trans young people were more likely to have experienced suicidal thoughts and feelings. We're talking about roughly 75%, so 3/4 of lesbian young women and roughly 75% of trans young people have experienced suicidal thoughts and feelings. Again, examples of vignettes. My friend died of an overdose and we'll never know whether or not it was on purpose. It's very hard to grieve not knowing why or how someone died. I'm a trans woman. I'm 25 years old. I've lost 3 friends to suicide and I rescued another one. My housemate, who was trans, killed herself and I am so very, very mad at her. I can't even be sad. This is something that is normal when people grieve suicide, that anger is a big part of the bereavement. I'm watching my 18-year-old nibbling. Nibbling is a gender-neutral term for niece or nephew. I'm watching my 18-year-old nibbling come out as NB, and I'm so proud of them. And also, all I can think is, oh God, please don't kill yourself. I also wanted to talk about hate crimes. Unfortunately, suicide and hate crimes are actually linked pretty closely for LGBTQIA+ people. The Pulse shooting in Orlando was nearly 7 years ago, 8 years ago now. and I feel like it just happened last month. This was a shooting in a gay club in Orlando, Florida, where about 50 people died. You heard about Brianna. So this is from a session. One of my clients just came in. I hadn't heard about the murder, but they just came in with, you heard about Brianna. I think by now we probably all have. A couple of other examples. Club Q was known as a safe haven for the LGBTQ community in Colorado Springs. A feeling shattered when a gunman entered the nightclub and opened fire. So this is December 2022, it's quite recent. Again, about 50 people were killed in a queer nightclub. This is in the US. And then here in Britain, the number of reported homophobic hate crime cases has tripled from around 6,000 in 2014-15 to around 18,000 in 2019-2020. Obviously, I think the BBC article here is quite careful to express that this is an increase in the reporting. It doesn't mean hate crime has necessarily increased a lot. It might have, but it also means people are more likely to report it. So I just wanted to bring up Next Benedict, although this is pretty tricky to talk about. So Next was non-binary. What happened is there was a history of bullying in their school, and one day they were in the wrong bathroom. They were in the girls' bathroom, and they got attacked. They were there with a friend of theirs, a trans friend, and they were attacked by three older girls. They got beaten up pretty bad, and then they died the next day. This is in February, so just a couple of months ago. And for a while, for a few days, you know, we weren't sure if these girls had accidentally killed Next. It has since transpired that Next died by suicide, so they chose to end their life with by taking an overdose of medication. And this is just a couple of days after the bullying that happened at school. They were suspended. So after they got beaten up in the bathroom, they were suspended because they had been in the wrong bathroom. They were suspended from school for a few days or weeks, I can't remember. And then they decided to die by suicide. So again, this is an example of how it is technically not recorded as a hate crime because Next died by suicide. But I just want you to hold in your mind how complicated this is and how complicated it is to grieve. Obviously for the people who knew and loved Next, obviously for their friend who was with them in the bathroom, their family. And then I also want to spare a thought for the girls who fought with Next and effectively ended up causing their death. And I just also wonder what it's like for them to grieve that. So anyway, the whole situation is just awful, awful and messy. And I don't know how the grieving process is going to be able to happen around this. Just a few images of queer grief with a lot of solidarity. Oh, sorry. My apologies. I'm just going to move on. Hate crime, suicide, attacks on the queer community. I just want to acknowledge it's kind of been a rough week for trans people in Britain. And I guess I'm just like feeling that a little bit today as we talk about this. So because there is violence against queer people and because this violence can lead to death, queer people, of course, and then people who love queer people live with this anxiety. So an example from a mom: I live in constant fear of something happening to my daughter in school or online. You hear all about this cyberbullying. I have no idea what happens on TikTok. It's normal for teenagers to do things that parents don't approve of, and it's normal that she doesn't tell me everything. I know that. She should be able to just be a normal kid without her mom breathing down her neck about her every social interaction. But I can't help but think that for other kids, it's not life or death. There's also something around disenfranchised grief. So you might be familiar with that term. It's when a death happens, but we feel like we don't necessarily have permission or we don't have space to grieve. So I feel like such an idiot. I'm a grown adult and I'm crying over the death of some teenage girl I never met. Um, I heard that from various clients when Brianna died, um, when she was murdered. A lot of people were very touched by that, but obviously none of us knew her personally. So what do you do with your grief? Where do you put that? Um, some girl in Saudi Arabia killed herself because she was forced to detransition, and somehow I'm crying real tears over my Instagram as if she was my childhood best friend. Seriously, what's wrong with me? I found out my ex's flatmate from back then killed herself, and I couldn't get out of bed for 3 days. We hung out for maybe 6 months. I haven't spoken to her in years. What even is this? These are testimonies of people who are feeling grief, but feel like they shouldn't feel grief and don't know what to do with it. Community bereavement. Humans are a small group primates. We are affected when one of our own is killed or dies a traumatic death. So even though the LGBT community doesn't always feel like a community, we're certainly not a monolith, and it's not like we're all pals. When someone gets killed for being gay or trans, it does feel like it's one of our own who's been attacked. And you always wonder, could that happen to me or my kids? I just felt like I needed something to cry about. I witnessed so much rejection, so much discrimination, so much hate, and I can see how that all destroys people. But obviously, 99% of the time, no one dies. So you just do your best to get on with it, and you can't grieve every microaggression, or you can't grieve systemic marginalization. So being able to just be sad, fully crying with a bunch of other queers in George Square, I guess that was really cathartic. And I didn't know how much I needed this. George Square is one of the, it's here in Glasgow. It's where we go for events, and this is where the vigil took place for Brianna. And yeah, it was a lot of people who had never met Brianna, but there was a lot of trans people there and queer people just having a really good cry, which we all really needed. Oh, sorry. Projected grief. So this is a little bit complex, but I'm sure you're going to get it. So this is a testimony from a gay man. I live with HIV. It's all fine. I go for checkups, but at this point, it's pretty much undetectable. I take antivirals and it's perfectly manageable. It doesn't affect my life at all. I didn't watch It's a Sin. It's a Sin, the TV show on Channel 4. I tend to stay away from stories about the AIDS epidemic. They always make my spine go cold. It feels like grieving for the ghost of some alternative version of myself. It's a bit too close to home. So this is someone who hasn't been bereaved and is technically not grieving, but it's almost like they had a near-death experience because they contracted HIV in an age where we can treat HIV and this person is safe. But it just feels like, yeah, it's a bit too close to home to think about how many people died during the AIDS epidemic. So on that, I kind of want to talk about grief and politics. Sometimes it's hard to find the line between your own personal bereavement or your own feelings around grief and the absolute outrage at the political situation. Yet another trans person dies and you're sad because it's a friend of a friend or an old colleague, someone you've dated for a bit, and it's the end of a life. It's a tragedy. But also it feels like yet another trans person died. At what point do we start holding people accountable for the terrible environment we're providing for trans people and trans kids? When is it appropriate to move from grief to political action? Again, I think this is something this week that a lot of us have in our minds, and it's a real problem because grief is an emotional process. It's a personal process. It's an intimate process. But then challenging political decisions and systemic social marginalization is not intimate and it's not personal. It's happening at a systemic level, and it's just really hard to move from one to the other. Just a little bit about the AIDS epidemic again. So Larry Kramer founded ACT UP in 1987, 6 years into the AIDS epidemic officially, I guess. And he said, "Unless we fight for our lives, we shall die." ACT UP used die-ins for many years as a tactic for impactful protests, followed by staged public funerals. In 1992, in a demonstration known as Ashes Action, activists gathered in Washington, D.C., some carrying the ashes and bone chips of loved ones who had died of AIDS to disperse over the White House lawn. But then, before ACT UP, in February of '87, Cleve Jones created the first panel of the AIDS memorial quilt. When the quilt was first displayed at the end of 1987, it had 1,920 names of people who died of AIDS, and then it grew to include over 10,000. So if you're not familiar with the AIDS memorial quilts, anyone who had lost someone to AIDS could just sew or patchwork a little square, and it was added to a giant quilt, celebrating the lives of people who had died of AIDS without care.